start in this debate, I'm going to state the key definitions. I'm going to state our burden to prove and also cite opposition's burden to prove, our policy, status quo, and then I'm going to state a few points. Now, firstly, culture assimilation is when two cultures are technically combined, and then national building concepts. Colonized states are states that have been colonized in the past and are no longer colonized, but they have the influence from the past. And then culture preservation is the preservation of their original culture. Our burden to prove to you today is how culture assimilation is good, and for such opposition, their burden to prove to us in this debate is how culture assimilation is bad and how culture preservation is actually good. When culture assimilation proves that we accept the fact that we have been colonized and we want to take effort in stating that when we build and when we make our economy better and so on and so forth. Our policy to you is in status quo right now. For example, Malaysia, we technically sort of accept it. Now, in post-colonial states, I agree that colonizers will leave some influence. When British colonized Malaysia, people started speaking English, eating fish and chips. We started international schools. This shows that we have taken influence from other countries and tried to place it into our own countries to expand the nation to show that we actually want to care what is happening in the world. It shows that we are trying to move forward in society, showing that we actually are trying to prove something in society, not staying back and stuck in the past. E.g. when British colonized Malaysia, these cultures are already integrated into are also integrated into people's daily life. This is status quo, okay? This is just another repetition of status quo. In our opinion, we should have national building concepts about all our culture in all our history. If it is bad, it gives us a means to celebrate that we have actually passed our colonization stage. It's to prove that we accept and we are trying to spread a bit of influence from when we were colonized. We'll just silent my picture.
I think next speaker, I'll call upon leaders of opposition. Here.
Government is unable to engage with the idea of cultural preservation and not talk about why communities deserve to have their own space away from the majority culture that is likely going to infiltrate on them in the world of cultural assimilation is the point at which they lose. Two things my speech then. Firstly, on three things. Firstly, on some framing, then one major response to the PM's push about how it's a response to colonization and how people can assimilate after colonization, and then one main argument on eco-representation. So firstly, two broad observations at the top of this speech. Note how there is no negative comparative, no negative comparative from the PM speech. They don't necessarily tell you why cultural preservation is something that is necessarily so harmful or something that could actually hinder the process to national integration. But then they also don't really prove why specifically cultural assimilation is the only key to be able to do this. I don't understand at the end of the first speech how any kind of the impacts that we obtain on us at the house, how any kind of impacts that they obtain on theirs at the house, if any, are things that we cannot have on ours at the house as well. So some three pieces of reading that. Firstly, on what cultural assimilation actually looks like. We know that it's likely going to look like integrating different aspects of people's culture, not just to multiple cultures, And it looks like things like visiting each other during various festivals like Chinese New Year or Diwali. It looks like banning practices. This is the third piece of it, and it's most important. It looks like banning practices that other cultures and races view as controversial in the pursuit of national integrity and national integration. Why is this specifically true and why is it important? Because the best interest of the national integration is something that is like less controversial and is more palatable for the masses. This is specifically going to be really important in my first argument. The idea of palatability and why that has to apply for there to be any kind of assimilation under government. So what does cultural preservation look like? Which Oji doesn't really frame here, so I'm going to do it now. It looks like these like communities being allowed to carry like minority groups specifically, like the Orang Asli or the Bumi Putra in Sarawak, being allowed to carry out their individual traditions, being able to live in their own closed communities that are independent of the like majority communities in like these states in the first place. We tell you that it also just looks like being able to practice your culture in peace to its fullest extent and not having to compromise for a majority group that may not tolerate your pursuit in the first place. So on to post-colonial states then, because OG also misses out on framing on this. We tell you that these states are likely to be vulnerable and are likely going to be high amounts of splintering based on racial and geographical differences. This is a direct result of colonization. We tell you that those are countries like Malaysia or most like Southeast Asian countries that have already faced colonization by Western powers in the past. We likely have racial differences used against them in the process of colonization. For example, when the Japanese colonized Malaysia in 1945, they compared and notably treated the Chinese and the Indians far worse than the Malays. And that specifically is like a key example of how racial differences has been used to divide the nations and like divide people on the ground in post-colonial states. And that's specifically why these cultures need to stay separate, because the wound that form from these are deep to the point where that is something they have to integrate from the first place. On to national integration then. We think that equal representation is the most important key to national integrity and the ability to practice your culture in peace. This is true for two reasons. Firstly, because you were not able to practice your culture to your fullest extent during colonization, when it was not palatable to your colonizers, and when it's something that they actively barred you from practicing to bar you from giving them power. But then secondly, we know that integration only exists when everyone feels that their best interests are fulfilled and that they are treated completely fairly. We tell you this only happens under opposition when people are able to practice their culture to the fullest extent. Also, just like influential part on democracy, right? Because we tell you that when everyone is able to like express their fullest opinions in a democracy, to the most honest and to the highest extent, that is a point at which there is a true democracy that everyone feels satisfied in. That is a similar concept with national integration. The government burden has always been to prove why cultural assimilation specifically can increase the likelihood of national integrity. We think they have failed to do so. But then one minor response to the Prime Minister on how it's a response to colonization, we don't understand why we can't have this on our side of the house, insofar as the ability to practice your culture to its full extent in peace is something that people should want to prioritize in the pursuit of national integration. So one argument then on equal representation, but before that, I'll take a point. Okay, moving on. So one argument on equal representation, 3 layers to this. And if I can prove this to you, I show you how only under opposition are you able to attain like equal representation and be able to achieve that kind of national integrity through cultural preservation. So 3 layers here. Firstly, on how minority group being assimilated into a majority group likely leads to less representation of government side of the house. In a melting pot, if all the flavors are mixed together and there's going to be a minority, that minority is probably going to come out less. So for example, if you have a TV program that shows Satu Malaysia or shows like Keluarga Malaysia, it's likely that the minority group is going to be represented to a lesser extent insofar as 3 things are true. Firstly, that there's simply less people in a minority group to be able to provide that representation in the first place. Secondly, that minority groups have often been barred from your own culture to the extent where you're unable to unable to practice it for a long period of time under colonization. Or thirdly, simply because they have less of a voice in society due to their lower numbers. That means that they're not able to practice that. That means they're not able to have their culture be represented in these to the fullest extent. But even on government's best case, where the culture is represented, we tell you that this culture is not likely going to be represented in a way that is good, that is like comprehensive, nuanced, and productive. Why is this true? Because if you want to portray something to a wider audience, it's very likely that you have to water it down and you have to simplify it to the point where it's not a full reflection of what the culture actually is, because that is what is more palatable to the entirety of the country for national integration. What are the impacts of this? We tell you 2 things. Firstly, it's a loss of identity, where your culture is inevitably watered down to be able to handle to the masses, to be able to make the majority group feel more satisfied about your presence here. When you have to be more palatable to the majority, the value of the things that you provide are inherently going to have to be watered down in the process. The second impact here is also just about not being able to have fair and equal representation, right? Because you do not have the same amount of voice and the majority group does under government side. And that specifically means that you're not able to so that specifically means that if you are even able to access your culture at all, that you are not able to express it to the fullest extent that would make your representation equal under government. And we tell you that specifically is already harmful in and of itself. But we'll note the comparative here, right? Because under our side of the house, where culture is preserved by these close minority groups, then they're able to practice their culture to the fullest extent, even in the ways that are not palatable and that are not comfortable to be received by the masses. We tell you that under our side, when our culture is not watered down to be accepted, you're able to provide you're able to practice your culture in more than one space, and that specifically is so important in this pursuit of national integration for the reasons that I told you in framing. With that, there's also just even if nothing else, by the way, tell you that if nothing else, that if there's no response to this from OG and there's no proper mechanization of the case, that it can't be this round. Okay,
I think the speaker called upon Deputy Prime Minister. Yes.
Am I audible at this volume? I don't get I don't get OO's claim when they say that apparently the minority group's culture will be watered down, right? Surely, if cultural assimilation actually happens, I can still have many restaurants, different minority groups, each restaurant. I can have maybe if I do cultural assimilation and I was colonized by British, I can have a fish and chips restaurant, and I have all the other minority groups. Cultures live together. It's not like some cultures just get washed away, right? This is the problem here. Because for example, in Malaysia, or maybe Sarawak, it's obviously a very diverse state. And obviously, here we have cultural assimilation basically inactive, right? Where we were colonized by the British, and now probably the British traditions or culture is actually very integrated into our daily life. Maybe we speak English a lot, maybe we go to international schools, we eat fish and chips, all these things, right? But surely, it's not like the Bidayu or the Dayaks are very washed up. There are still traditional food here that we celebrate. There are still different cultures that we celebrate based on these types of minorities. It's not like just because I speak English and I like fish and chips doesn't mean that these minority groups get washed away or these cultures, I just don't care about them, right? This is the logical link that it brings out here. Because I do not get how that these cultures cannot live together when here in Sarawak I can literally say it here. Yes, you might say that I speak English really well, which means because I go to an international school or something, or because I like eating fish and chips, so I'm very British based, so I might have a British accent or something. But it's not that I don't care about my own Chinese background. I do not care about the Dayak people living here. I do not care about maybe the Indians who still live in Sarawak. This cultural assimilation happens in Sarawak. Yeah, I do not get how cultures are washed away. Right? So number one, they ask us two questions I think in OG and OO. Right? Number one, they said that we don't tell them the harms of cultural preservation outside. We tell you number one, the harm of cultural preservation is that you directly leave out the part where you're colonized. Yes, you preserve the Baba and Nonya, or you preserve the dialect. But the point is, like I've said, the colonization, or the British, for example, the culture is directly integrated into our culture today. I was colonized by British, Sarawak was colonized by British. The culture is directly integrated. The fact that I leave it out does not mean that I include more minorities. It means that I leave it out, even though the culture is directly integrated in the whole picture. So I tell you here that on our side it's simple. We should be proud of our history no matter what. Right? Sure, maybe the British or the Japanese treat us super bad. Maybe they put us they enslave us or something, right? Or they treat us really bad, they don't even pay us or something. Well, what's going to happen here is that sure, you have ancient building concepts about your own culture, but when being colonized is such a big part of your history, and there's such an influence over such a huge part of your culture, you shouldn't leave it out even if it's that bad, right? So what's gonna what we think should happen is that number one, cultures are not going to be that diluted, and even if it is, leaving out such a huge part of our culture is just against what they're saying. Because notice that what they're saying is they want to keep cultures alive, but they're leaving out the culture that is so integrated into the culture today, which is just contradicting themselves. Number two, I think here that this will help like other countries or other people, or like even the citizens in the state itself feel like they are more accepting and they include more people. Yes.
How do you contend with the idea that certain cultures will have to make their culture more watered down to be palatable to the majority?
Okay. They should make their cultures more watered down to be palatable to the majority, right? So here I think it's like a trade-off, right? Because notice that on your side, cultural preservation, sure. You preserve the culture by like you advertise it. You say that, oh look, the diet food is extremely nice and this is very nice. They still have to water it down for you, right? You can't just like on both sides, if you in both sides when you advertise it or when you promote it or you support it, they still have to water it down for you. Because it happens on both sides. So number two, this is probably as a citizen or as or other countries or like the state itself. If you include the whole culture, because it's clear here that the culture of the colonizers affects you and affects every single person. I start speaking English, the international schools are popping up, and there are like many like British cuisine places out there. And the fact that the culture is so integrated, I think this will help us when cultural assimilation is here. It means that we tell people that not that we forgive you, but we put that in the past. Whatever colonizers we have, yes, they treated us so bad. But now that our culture is part of it and we were influenced by it, we tell you that we put it in the past and we tell everyone that now we are willing to live together with our cultures together. And I think that is to the point where we actually win. Because the point is, we live together and probably our cultures are not going to be as diluted, because in Sarawak, we probably still live in the same, probably our culture is not that diluted right in Sarawak, because we have like so many diversity, and there's still a lot of British influence here. But number three, we think that maybe the colonizers will feel like on your side, you're intentionally leaving them out of the full picture. As British maybe, I feel like there's a lot of people making jokes if they look at a white person, they'll shout like "Penjaja" and that. So what I think here, when we promote cultural assimilation, it's going to promote something what I'm going to say. We leave it in the past and we promote the culture that's already been affecting us for this entire time. After colonization, I'm still affected by it, so might as well put it in the past because it directly influences our whole culture in the first place, right? So anyway, they also said that only in opposition, people can practice their culture to their fullest extent in peace. But the point is, I am very influenced by British culture, right? And it's not like it's not that I don't practice any other culture like my own Chinese culture. I still practice my own Chinese culture, even though I'm heavily influenced by British. Just the fact that in opposition, they say that people can practice only in opposition, they can practice their culture to their fullest extent is very weird. Because on our side, we live together and I can practice both sides of my culture, the British influence of my culture and the Chinese influence of my culture. I can do it together, and that is when we promote both sides together. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for 1 year old.
Am I audible at this volume? Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. This debate is not about fish and chips. This debate is not about eating food and going to speak English. This is about practices people view as unnatural. It is not about colonizers. It is not about people who do not care about culture. Because if it were, then there wouldn't be a debate to be had. Because these people never cared about whether they could celebrate Chinese New Year or the specific practices that other people view. It's about the people who honestly care about their culture, who derive a lot of fulfillment from it, who feel that if their culture was taken away from them, then there's no point living in Malaysia if I can't be who I truly am. Before I'm moving on to one argument about how this splinters unity, I think there's a few responses that I have to make. Firstly, one major clarification, because I think OO misunderstands the impact of culture, right? There's been zero engagement so far as to why preserving culture is somehow good. They've never talked about the impacts of culture or as to why culture is so specifically important to a community as a whole. But secondly, we tell you why it is specifically so important to preserve culture in a post-conflict state. We tell you that in a post-conflict state, it's likely going to be a majoritarian race, and we tell you that if assimilation was done, it's mostly done in favor of the majoritarian race. By virtue of you wanting to make culture more understandable and palatable, you will have to cater it to these people. So this is like things like banning practices that people view as unnatural because they think that it's not like acceptable that you eat different types of food than them, or it looks like banning practices that people view as like uncomfortable because they don't want to see those types of things. It looks like wanting to sacrifice culture in return for like a more united community. But secondly, we tell you that this isn't this isn't fully mutually exclusive. Because we say that national integration has practices like they are different from cultural preservation. So just because you have cultural preservation practices does not mean that you have to abandon national integration as a whole. We still think that you can teach English if you feel that English is an important tool for people, for Malaysians to grow up and understand the world that they live in. This isn't fully mutually exclusive to the side of opening government. But also a major response there. Because I think they try to wash out the debate by telling us that you don't have to make your culture more palatable. But no, if they want the impacts of their assimilation to accrue, then they have to realize that in order for people to accept your culture, you have to make it understandable to them. You have to compromise it. So it does mean that you have to make your culture more palatable, and we've given you structural reasons why that is bad. But onto one argument then, before I move on to a few preamps for the closing government. Onto arguments then on unity. We tell you that when you specifically want to preserve culture, when you specifically want assimilated practices, when you water down different parts of culture, we are going to tell you that it splinters these communities because there's going to be infighting among them as to whether assimilation is good or not. We tell you that unity in sectors is a greater priority than unity as a group. Because these people are closer to members of their own community, right? They grow up with them, right? So if they have to make a measurement of whether their community is united or not, they look to members of their own community first, and that's why we ought to prioritize unity as a community first before we prioritize unity as a nation. So why is unity harm with assimilated practices? For the very simple fact that people oppose assimilation, right? It doesn't matter if it's the way to move forward. If I'm a person who has studiously practiced culture and who dream of practicing culture and couldn't do so because I was getting colonized, it's going to be a sensitive point for me because I think that when I am free and my country is independent, I ought to be able to practice my culture in the way that I want. But secondly, on assimilation practices, it's not just that some people will care and some people will not. Some people agree with these assimilation practices and agree that it's the way to move forward, and that's where our impact happens, right? Because we say that cultures in post-colonial states are already splintered. They couldn't practice their culture safely during colonization. There was fighting in ethnic groups because of things like half of the Chinese people in Malaysia last time being advocating for communist practices and the other side helping the British look for those specific Chinese people. We say that there's already a harm of unity on that front, and that is why you cannot sacrifice unity any further. What are the impacts of this? Firstly, on splintering, right? We tell you that people in these communities would fight over whether they should assimilate. This means there's infighting in groups. When people say that, oh, we should sacrifice our culture because I think that it will make us a more united community, and your grandfather says, why are you betraying your culture to live with these other people that we don't even know? Why do you want to make your culture more palatable when it's your heritage and your history? And that is where the argument starts. That is where the infighting starts, and that's where communities become more splintered as a whole. But secondly, we tell you that people are more willing to accept, the comparative here is that unity in sectors would lead to unity as a group. Two reasons why. Because people are has discontent with the government. They think that if the government allows them to practice their cultural practices in a way that they would like, then they are happier with the government and more likely to comply with other national integration policies. People feel comfortable in the country that they can practice their culture and are less likely to antagonize the government. On to solvency then, how do we ensure a better side for our side of the house? People can maintain their cultural practices and fix their community, right? They can practice their cultural practices without foreign influence. This means is that the first and most important impact is that there's more protection for cultural practices because there's more bargaining power. If you have your entire community saying that we should preserve culture and the government supports you preserving culture, then there's more protection for cultural practices for the people that most need that. On the flip side, if you don't do this and there's infighting and half of the Chinese people think that we should cancel Chinese New Year and the other half say no, we should not cancel Chinese New Year, then there's less bargaining power for the cultural practices that people so value. So how does this weigh over unity? We tell you that unity is meaningless if you erase a culture. We tell you that unity is meaningless if it comes at the expense of leaving certain things out of history books because you think it harms national integration. We do not think that the loss of identity is worth a unity that is meaningless because it only appeals to the majoritarian sector. But on to a few preempts for the side of closing government. I think they're going to say that if you don't have national integration, people are going to be racist and there's going to be polarization, right? There's a few responses here. Firstly, mitigated by the fact that they still go to school together, that they still probably have some form of interaction, that they still are a community who is living together and still have some form of interaction. So just because they have cultural practices that they practice on their own does not mean that they have zero interaction and that. But secondly, we flip this, right? Because there are certain parts of culture that people simply won't understand. So if you spend your time making it more palatable, knowing that there's a sector of the community that still wants to practice that forms of culture, those who do want to practice actual culture get more racism because there are how many people can point at assimilated ethnic groups and say, if they can be normal, why can't you be normal as well? So it then means that the culture of these people are further diminished when their own community won't even protect them because they think that it's the way to move forward. But on to polarization, we say that people become even more radicalized when you don't let them practice out and proud, when you don't let them practice their culture in a way that's respected and protected. We tell you that the government sends a social signaling effect when they would rather prioritize unity in ways that appeal to the majoritarian sector instead of protecting the people that need the most. We tell you that it's weaponized against the government when people start movements that tell you that the government doesn't care about culture and it's time for us to do something. CG has to prove why all of these impacts are less important. We don't believe that cultural preservation should be at the expense of unity. Thank you.
Next speaker, call upon members of government. Okay.
Chair, OO has missed the point of this debate here. We tell you here that on CG, we have won this debate easily because opposition here only said that minorities won't get any attention, but they will get more than what Op is going to say. Don't get caught into their fairyland here, panel, because CG will prove why we have won this debate. I have two responses to show you. Here's what on what opposition said about how we want to assimilate, they will split the community because they will fight, and the second response about how ethnic minorities have no voice. And I have two extensions to give you here. Number one, being how nation would unite through a shared identity. The nation will unite through a shared identity. And number two, on how the cultural assimilation prevents any tension or conflict of the ethnic group. And I'll tell you after that why we have won this debate easily. So first on some responses here. My first response on why what opposition here said how when we want to assimilate, it will split the community because they will fight. You see here that they will not fight. It's not that easy because we will choose a failure way to approach them instead of what government said here, instead of what OG said here. And we say that we'll be more friendly with them. We'll say that we have a more shared connection with them. We're not just going to say they will have no voice. We'll just give them as equal as they really, really want. We'll give them what they really, really want also. We give them the resources if they need any for all the ethnic minority groups. We here tell you that we will choose a failure way of approaching these ethnic minority groups instead of fighting like OOG here. And now on my second response here on what opposition just said about how ethnic minorities have no voice. Okay, here we will say that yes, they might not have much of a voice, but here we tell you that they have a bigger voice than on opposition side. We tell you here that the ethnic minorities will gain more recognition on our side than on opposition side. We tell you here that opposition still thinks that these ethnic minorities, they think that these ethnic minorities, if it's based on preservation, they just say that, oh, we can just deal with them later. But here on our side, we think we should deal with them now, so they'll have a voice in the future, so that our nation will be, our state here will be better in the future as a whole. And before moving on,
There's a glaring lack of counterfactual from both government benches. We've explained to you what cultural preservation practices look like. Now what do cultural assimilation practices look like?
we tell you here that the cultural assimilation here means that these ethnic groups they will adapt to each other. They'll be friendly with each other. They'll be happy with each other. Instead of your guys' side of cultural preservation, just focus on that one big majority group. Focus on and don't deal with the minority group after that. That's the problem on opposition side here. So moving on to my first extension on number one, on how the nation will unite through a shared identity. Why is this actually true? Okay, I'll give an example of this. Malaysia. We'll say here Indians, Malays, and Chinese. They live in this one country with a shared identity. It's Malaysia. So another reason why this is true because number two, the cultural assimilation here helps everyone in the nation. This includes the minorities, which is exclusive only to our side of the house here. So why is this really important? We tell you here that number one, the nation will live in peace and not conflict like what opposition just said. And number two, the nation will be at its peak, as in we have no conflicts, no fighting, but love for one another. This is exclusive on our side of the house, and I will explain a bit more later on. So what's the bottom line of this argument here? We tell you that this post-colonial state will be very successful in the future because the state here will be united. And moving on to my second extension here, on how cultural assimilation prevent any tension or conflict within these ethnic groups. This is true because number one, conflict usually happens because people will disagree with some things. On our side here, like I said earlier, we'll approach them in a friendly way. We won't, if there's anything to disagree with and to fight with, we won't cause any conflict. We will not want to fight. That's the point of this debate here. We don't want the minority groups, we don't want the big groups to fight with one another. On our side here, we tell you that in the future, these ethnic groups will not fight each other because they learn to embrace love, then embrace hate like what opposition said earlier. So why is it important? Number one, it prevents conflict, which will lead to a nation that's peaceful and have harmony. Number two, it strengthens unity within the country, like I said earlier. And number three, minority groups will be benefited because they won't get attacked by the bigger ethnic group. So what's the bottom line of this debate here, of this argument here? We tell you that the tension and the conflict cease to exist on our side, which is absolutely exclusive on our side here, panel, which is why we have won this debate 100%. Before moving on, any of your eyes? 3, 2, go.
How is unity achieved on your end? And why wouldn't there be discontent when people forced to sacrifice their culture for an identity they don't even want in the first place?
Okay, this is the same reason as why Malays and Chinese and Indians, they live through one shared identity, which is Malaysia. They will live there to have their own to get their own benefits. They won't stay in one minority group living with sticks and stones with no gadgets, no devices. So moving on to why do we win this debate here? Because on our side here, we tell you that the stakeholders and everyone here is benefited, and I'll explain everything now. Number one, on our side here, we tell you that the nation will unite, it will boost the development of everything because everyone here will work together. I tell you this because the post-colonial states are states that have just been colonized and now they're free from their colonizer. They need to unite to help their own country, to boost their own economy, and to help the country as a whole. Number two, why do these minority groups benefited on our side more than OG or opposition here? Why? We tell you here exclusively, the nation will unite and be the best it can be, which will boost the development on our side, like I said earlier, because of the teamwork and sharing of minerals and resources from these ethnic groups. On up here, the state will stay as a third world country because they will just fight with each other instead of establishing an actual relationship. There's a reason why Malaysia is successful. It's because each ethnic diversity is working together and working with one another in a peaceful and harmony. So what's the impact here on our side? We tell you here that these post-colonial states are well developed more than opposition. And number two, the ethnic minorities here will have a voice in the state. They'll have a voice instead of one side side opposition has been saying in their debate. So their case is completely swamped already, and we have won this debate here.
I think the speaker will call upon members of members of opposition.
Can I get like 30 seconds? Chair, okay, my speech is starting in 3, 2, 1. Chair, government does not care about all of these small minority groups. Right? All they want to do is to mix up everything and let the dominant culture spread. So before the debate actually begins, I want to address some key framing that's missed out in the opening. So what actually happens when cultural assimilation occurs? So we tell you that when these dominant and minority cultures get mixed, the dominant culture will become more prevalent than the minority group. So what's something that's missed out is that even if cultural preservation occurs, there's still going to be some natural assimilation that will happen anyways, even in cultural preservation. This is not something that is mutually exclusive to cultural assimilation. And I'll address this later. So in my speech today, we'll tell you the true about those, and then we will build opening opposition's case for them by addressing 3 points. Firstly, how the minority groups lose their identity. Secondly, how to get a safe space to practice their culture. And thirdly, why the media is more likely to want to water down their content. So beginning with my rebuttals. So firstly, on CBA, they claim that they will approach the minority groups friendly, and they will like have a shared connection, and they will like be equal. So we told you that there is no proper friendly way to assimilate, right? The minority group will never be able to be equal to the dominant group purely because they are a smaller group. They have less people in the culture, they have less voices. So they're like, point this really just false. And on their second point, government tells you about how like they have a shared identity, and they just assert that when people are like all mixed together, they'll be peaceful and happy. So government goes on to say like, look in Malaysia, there's like Chinese, Malay, India. So we say, what about the Bidayo people? What about the like Tamadun people? What about all these other minority groups that get left out? So Malaysia will not, any country will not be able to live in peace with cultural assimilation, because even in people's like, already says that in cultural preservation you are so tolerant. There's not actually going to likely be a lot of fighting anyways in cultural preservation. So what we do is that we don't want to fight, and then we want to live in a peaceful culture. On opposition, we just want to be able to live in a peaceful culture where I can exist, you can exist, we can like coexist, and we can like have some interaction. And so with that, closing government's case false. It's not of course about some key analysis that's missed out in opening opposition. So what they say is they say that minority equals less representation. But what we are going to tell you is why these minority groups are likely to have the loss of identity when cultural assimilation occurs. So just take note that how some assimilation happens anyways naturally. Because people in the same country, over time, they naturally will slightly assimilate because they're so close together, they're in close proximity every day. So what you do is when a nation chooses to artificially mix everything up, the dominant group will stay dominant, okay? And because of this, the minority group will not feel very seen. Why is this true? This is because in Malay and Indian cultures, they just have more prevalence compared to the smaller cultures like Hamadun, Bidayo, etc. So when you artificially assimilate, these like Hamadun and foreign Hindu people, they just get lumped together under the dominant group, right? They just all get lumped, for example, like Malay. So then, because of this, as a like minority group, they will feel dissatisfied, right? Because they're already like, they just got colonized, or they already have been colonized, and then now they also can't even fully follow their own culture. Because of this, they're going to be likely to harbor hatred and dissatisfaction, really because they can't carry out their own culture, right? They harbor hatred towards the dominant group because they like get taken over, and they feel hatred against the like colonizers, right? Because now they can't even practice their own culture in peace. So because of this is what's going to happen. For example, like if you ask like any outsider, right, majority of them have never even heard of like Orang Hutu, for example. This is because of like everything just gets all lumped up together into one like group, right? All the minority groups just get left out. So when the dominant group stays dominant, other smaller cultures, because of this, they'll lose their sense of identity, right? Because you just feel, oh, I'm like, my culture's not even good enough to be part of like, to be its own part, right? So these minority groups just get everything taken away from them. So I'll tell you how these minority groups can practice in a more nuanced space with cultural preservation. So, opening opposition to the is, however, how we add up for them is that we prove you how these minority groups get this in one space. Note that even in cultural preservation, there's still some cultural assimilation, right? And OO does not talk about this at all. So we tell you that even though some assimilation occurs, people are still going to be able to practice in peace because it's something that occurs naturally. Essentially, in cultural assimilation, the minority groups will feel discriminated against because they are not even allowed to enjoy for the little that they have. So I think on the biggest thing from that's missing from opening off space is that they just tell you about how the minority groups are likely to be watered down by the media. So we're actually gonna like build this case for them, okay? So they tell you that with cultural assimilation, the media are gonna prioritize palatability and minority groups are going to be watered down. So we on CEO impact this thing by telling you that the media is more likely to want to portray something that's watered down. This is because it serves more proximity to like the outside culture. Because although the media is about showing some diversity, people are actually not that interested in seeing something like crazy absurd or like weird to them, right? It's more likely that they want to see something that's unique, but not too like far away from their own culture. So for example, right, on the media you can see like Chinese culture. You see this like during Chinese New Year they give like ampons and stuff. Wherever they see, so like outside people on when you view the media, they just think this is more proximate to how it's cool for them. When you compare it to like, for example, like a video like dancing with sticks, I'm not being racist, but then like other people, they just don't really care about these like former traditional dances, right? What they want to see is like, oh look, wow, these Chinese give rap practice with like money inside, like this is so cool, this is like such a new concept to me. So the media doesn't want to show some like boring Sarakian people, right? They don't want to see like people like dancing with like culture or whatever. They want to show like, oh, the Deepavali patterns that like, oh wow, the Indians use like rice to like do these patterns. Wow, it's so cool. I think this is why the media is more likely to want to like portray these minority groups as more palatable. So because of this, side CEO. Thank you.
I think the speaker will call upon government.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First of all, I just want to start with talking about how the OG failed to understand the point of this debate, which is to prove that we, without cultural assimilation, we do not have the voice to voice out our needs, our differences, and everything else. So, fish and chips, international schools, languages. So, by doing like cultural assimilation, we're joining many languages together, and we're all just learning different languages. We can talk to one another. For example, let's say we learn Malay, and we go to KL, we can talk Malay with the people there, or we learn English, the universal language of this world. Going everywhere, we can talk to everyone in the universal language, and if we do not understand, if those people do not understand those universal languages, let's say in America, they only talk Spanish. So using cultural preservation, if we have some small minority group of Spanish people here, we can learn the Spanish languages, which can help us in this environment, in this world. So next, I just want to put down the overall community about talking about how we as a minority group in the country, we have no voice and we are unable to carry out cultures. Having the majority groups suppress us for doing cultures that are not society norms. So we tell you this here is that the cultures being able to carry out due to natural assimilation happening in cultural preservation, that is more likely to happen that when they, before cultural preservation, minority groups will group together to go against the majority groups who are suppressing their beliefs and everything. So when the minority groups come together, slowly but surely, I think that the minority groups will clearly be more dominant compared to the majority groups. So we talk to you here is that if you do not have cultural assimilation, all the majority groups will just try to influence show their dominance towards the minority group. That's why as the minority groups are already joining together to go against the majority group, so why not we just join all together and have a peaceful environment for everyone to share their beliefs and share their differences together. So I just want to point out to another OG of the second speaker of the OG. Talking about restaurants and cultures not being washed away due to having many restaurants around the world. So we can try different restaurants and many languages, and international schools, so on and so on. Sorry, no. So they say we have to be proud of our history because the British treated you bad, and it keeps our culture alive, which it affects everyone. So when they treat us bad, the cultures are separated. For example, how you see in Malaysia that ethnic groups are separated. To the kampong having Iban people, the city having Malaysian, Malays, Chinese, Indians, or one group with the Bidayos and the Arangulus and so on and so on. So we tell you here that those groups separating from each other actually creates a diversion from the economic growth of the country. Being these people being separated everywhere, we know that they will not come together working in, let's say they work in the village only. If they work in the village, those people, let's say the talented people in the village don't come out because of their scared of the racial differences that's put out there. So the racial differences actually make them scared to come out. But by using cultural assimilation, we tell you that racially motives will be ignored and these people will be more obligated to come out and share their voice around and everywhere. So also, we also need to let you point out the one view that if under cultural preservation, there will be a law, I mean there's a law that the groups are already treated differently and unequally. So doesn't this just promote inequality in the world? So I would like to just go on to the CO. So the CO has mentioned that we as a group, we don't care about the minorities. We as the government side, we don't really care about we don't care about the minorities. So, and they also mentioned that how natural assimilation happens by itself, which we strongly agree with. That's why, since it already happens by itself, why don't we just join it all together, since it's already happening? So there's also no peace even if you join. Well, I tell you that's truly not correct. So we will have peace if we join together because we all come together. So when we come together, we share our differences, we share our logic, and we can discuss opinions with cultures that we do not agree with, and we can come to a decision. So, and if you mix everything up, like the OCO has mentioned, the dominant will just stay dominant. But we also already told you that how this is not true because the minority groups are naturally assimilated by itself and will also fight back with the dominant groups. So the dominant groups will not be able to stay dominant. So, now moving on to my questions. So the first clash I want to address is national unity vs cultural fragmentation. So what the opposition side has been trying to push towards you is that we as the government side, we do not care about we do not care about the minorities, and we are now just trying to mix the group together, and it's not fair for everyone because we get bullied. The minorities get bullied by the majority groups. So why we tell you on government side, we're just trying to push the idea that we want equality. We want everyone from the villages, everywhere to come out there to voice their opinions so they can go economic growth. They can grow the economy with the job opportunities. They can join with the talented people from other villages joining to the world, coming to share their beliefs, share their identity, and share everything else. So what the actual clash here is why we win on this clash. So our side recognizes the importance of diversity, but we also understand to build a successful nation, we need unity through shared culture, not division. We acknowledge diversity, but it must be integrated with a common national framework. So who benefits the post-colonial state more? Why? On the outside, the state will still be on the third world country because no teamwork resources is given within the nation. As to say, the cultures are very divided around together. So we tell you that everyone's not contributing their resources to one another, and we will actually have a lack of ideas. Okay, yes. There's a giant assumption and a missing link that assimilation practices are perceived positively and lead to unity just like that. If people use it as a way to weaponize against the government, wouldn't this lead to more discord in communities and therefore no unity?
Okay. I tell you here that if you say that the government, we as a minority groups will just cause more conflict in the government, I tell you here that's not necessarily true. We have to stand up for ourselves against the majority groups who are constantly suppressing us. So moving on, last clash is who benefits the minorities more? It's 100% CG, and this is why we take the debate. So why? On our side, we exclusive benefit than others. So when we say they won't get any conflict, they will have more resources, they won't get killed by other group and instead work together. For example, let's say that in cultural preservation, if I do not like that group, I can just go over there and punch out the group and destroy them, and just burn everything else and do everything to them. If we cultural preservation, let's say the Orang groups are not willing to compromise their beliefs for the thing. The majority groups can just go over and attack them. So this is why I think we take the debate. With that, I must be
Speaker atau one outbreak here.
speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think the main clash of today's debate is simple, right? Side government's bench is trying to prove how coexistence through assimilation is better than preservation, whereas opposition's bench is trying to prove how cultural palatability will bring more long-term benefits in the future. My speech today is rather simple. I'll be completely disassembling both government benches speeches, starting with OG and then CG, before moving on to why our extension edges out over OO, before moving on to weighing and some mitigation, as well as a comparative and the better worst case scenario. Now moving on to OG, right? Firstly speaking, their Prime Minister fails to describe the image of these post-colonial countries. Like, they simply want to push forward the fact that they want these cultures to assimilate, and they push forward the fact that assimilation in itself is actually easy. They also push the burden to us to prove why preservation is a bad thing. However, this is uncharitable in the first place, because this debate is not about whether preservation or assimilation works faster to unite the country. It's about which method ensures less damage and harm. Next, they also do not cater to the minorities because there's a lack of factor analysis, and they don't really talk about what happens to them when you cause this assimilation. For the Deputy Prime Minister, he states that cultures can coexist in status quo, and they said they're willing to trade off cultural palatability because watering down is necessary for that culture to be realized in the first place. They say they are willing to adopt cultures from other denominations as well as colonizers. However, firstly, this does not bring any benefits in the current status quo, and secondly, they said they might as well put it in the past because we are influenced by the cultures of these colonizers in the first place. It would seem that the solution to this problem pushed forward by OG is to, instead of being after being colonized, if we just practice what they have taught to us after the colonization, it's better than just, they are basically pushing forward the fact that we should abandon our own culture instead of not practicing it when we are colonized and just pick up someone else's culture in the first place, hence in this case in the colonizers. Now for CG, they live in a fantasy of a world where they think people will simply assimilate together. They ignore the harms brought up by both opbenchers, and they also live in a world where they think people will just adopt the cultures of other majority parties. Why is this wrong? 3 reasons. Number 1, they say that assimilation prevents the splintering of unity, right? They say that they won't fight and they have a friendlier way of connecting with these minorities. However, there is no mechanization behind this, and they say they are willing to give resources on their side of the world. However, government expenditure is finite, and this method is only temporary and not long-lasting in the long run. Secondly, they say that there will be a bigger voice for minorities, right? They say that people will be happy to live with each other. However, number 1, we have already proved to you how assimilation brings more harms. There is a lack of mitigation behind this. And secondly, they say that we only care about the majority group. However, the only reason we are debating here today is to prove how preservation actually caters to the minorities in today's debate. Number 3, they said that there will be no conflict if we choose to assimilate. This is just an assumption because they say that when people are less prone to disagree with something in their world because they have a friendlier way of connecting with them, right? They say that the majorities will embrace minority cultures. However, this completely goes against the social hierarchy in current status quo. For example, racism to different races, so on and so forth. Now for the whip speaker of CG, he said that there will be peace when we join together. However, his solution to counter the fact, the POI that was questioned by OO, is to say that minorities will fight back with the dominant group once they assimilate. Firstly, we take this down completely because how is this unity? This only pushes inequality further, and it seems that CG's way to promote equality is through discord between the minority and majority groups. It seems CG is rushing towards a world where they want to develop from the post-colonial state. However, you can't achieve it if all you do is promote inequality amongst your community in the first place. Now, moving on to the weighing, right? Number 1, preservation is better in the long term for the people and the country because for the people, it maintains cultural originality, and we are not shunned by the majority simply because we refuse to practice what they are practicing. And for the country, we retain our image of cultural diversity, be it for majority or minority groups. And for contextualization, this looks like at schools, if you choose not to adopt the practices that are being practiced by other majority groups, right, you simply be ignored because you are not liked if you practice your own minority culture. Secondly, preservation, while yes, we trade off the fact that it is slow, but realize that in this debate today, we are not trying to debate about which achieves unity faster, right? We are talking about which brings less harms, and both opposition benches have been able to mitigate this properly because we already tell you that preservation doesn't bring any harm to anyone. We simply advocate and push for the fact that people and you shouldn't abandon their culture and artificially assimilate themselves into dominant groups. Number 3, take into account the state of post-colonial countries, right? These minorities have most probably already been colonized, and through assimilation, we are artificially asking them to adopt other dominant cultures and abandon their own. In conclusion, right, costs on our side are negligible, but by enforcing nation-building concepts through assimilation, the government risks discord amongst the community, which will bring to long-term bad effects. Now, for the main comparative of this debate, right, in our world, people are less likely to get shunned from society simply because they do not assimilate into other majority groups. This assumes that assimilation is even practical and feasible to carry out in the current status quo. In government's world, the nation loses cultural identity from minority groups, whilst also risking poor integration due to lack of accountability, as side CEO has constantly been rehashing over and over again, because we state and we push for the fact that people are dissatisfied because they cannot practice their own minority cultures freely because they are in fear of being neglected and being ignored by the majority groups. So, realize that the theme of today's debate is culture, right? Side CEO has already proved to you how we maintain cultural identity, why our house outweigh whatever benefits side government brings to us today, as well as fulfill all burdens pushed to us today as to why preservation is better in the long run. Government's entire argument runs on the assumption that people will just assimilate easily, and for all these reasons, we have never been proud to oppose. Thank you.
But the next speaker, I'll let invite everyone to cross the floor, shake hands, and